Ladies and gentlemen, it is now 10:02. We can recommence. I will very briefly apologise to those who are in attendance for this afternoon session, Cranbrook. We are currently still dealing with Paddock Wood, and we are aiming to end the Paddock Wood session roughly half an hour late, at past. So hopefully that will still leave us with sufficient time in the afternoon to accomplish all of the anticipated business for Cranbrook. I won't do as I normally do, which is introduce participants and processes at the beginning of this session now, because everybody participating in the Paddock Wood session has already been through that process and knows what they're doing. I will, however, return to an introductory process when new participants come to the front tables for Cranbrook. So, if we can return to the agenda, the items that we still need to address are items 4, 5 and 6. Now, as discussed before the break, 4 felt to me as though nearly everybody had drawn out everything that they needed to say as part of the preceding items. Can I just reality check that again and ask if anybody has anything further to say on 4? Nothing. In which case, we can proceed to item 5, which, given that the council...
Excuse me, sir. Sorry.
Apologies. Yes, I did forget you. Berkeley wanted to respond to the last item we were on before lunch.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. There's 4 points, sir. 5 points. Consultation, the role of Paddock Wood Town, infrastructure, and also ecology. And just, sir, on that ecology point, if the programme officer is there, this is just following on, sir, and I don't know whether this is the appropriate time to talk about it, sir, just in terms of, on the site visit, you posed some questions regarding the undergrounding of pylons.
Yes, I did, and actually this probably is the best time to get to it before we get into the detail of policy work. So, thank you.
Just on firstly, sir, then on the consultation point, excuse me, I still have my sandwich halfway down my throat, apologies. Mr. Songhurst mentioned the March consultation, and I think Mr. Moon as well. It's important, sir, to note that whilst the Maskell's Farm site was not allocated in March 2013, it was included in reference to the March 2013 DFD at paragraph 5.33, in terms of the council did invite comments on the Maskell's Farm site, even though it wasn't being proposed to be allocated at the time. So there was consultation of a sort then. There was also consultation that the Town Council undertook in March 2013, which included all 3 sites that were being considered. It was quite a small venue, but it was quite tight, very well attended and tightly packed in. And and also prior to the March consultations themselves, Berkeley undertook its own consultation in January 2013. So just in respect of its own site, at which, and I won't quote more statistics at you, I refer to it in paragraph 2.4 of my statement, where 73% of those attending expressed a preference for the Maskell's Farm site. Jen, just to hopefully reassure Mr. Songhurst in terms of the frustration regarding consultations, it's not Tunbridge Wells acting in a peculiar fashion in terms of preparing its own local plan. This is how local plans are produced up and down the country, to do with policy steering groups that are private and confidential, and that they very rarely have minutes as such. The recommendations of those are then referred upwards to then have a public airing prior to consultation. So Tunbridge Wells is not alone in terms of what it is doing in terms of preparing its own plan. In terms of Paddock Wood, the town itself is the second largest settlement, obviously outside Tunbridge Wells and South Ryde. Mr. Hinton referred to the earlier sessions talking about the role of Paddock Wood, but we also heard this morning from CPRE in terms of the role that Paddock Wood plays as a rural service centre, in terms of acting its role to the rural hinterland and the villages surrounding it. So in terms of what takes place within Paddock Wood, it's not necessarily solely just for the people and residents of Paddock Wood solely. Paddock Wood has a wider role in terms of its rural hinterland as well. And also, just very quickly, in terms of planning for housing, I think Mrs. Morris talked about the figure of 600, and we've already had 150 by windfall and so on. I'd just make a play for planning being far more important than just a simple numbers game, because without proper planning, you don't get the planned healthcare, you don't get the planned GP surgeries, and as I said earlier this afternoon, it's from the benefit of large-scale developments that you can get for that coordinated and planned infrastructure. On the infrastructure point, Mr. Songhurst made reference to some of my earlier comments. I don't think I actually said that the only reason it was coming forward was because to deliver the infrastructure. I think what I said was that the opportunity arises from the proposed allocation at Maskell's Farm to provide for improved and coordinated infrastructure rather than such infrastructure coming forward on a piecemeal basis. So that was the reference I was referring to there. So Mr. Songhurst also made reference to the ecology being destroyed at Maskell's Farm and impacting on Folhurst Wood. I think, sir, we agreed on the opening day of the inquiry, main issue, matter Ray, main issue 6, I think it was, that actually the biodiversity role of Folhurst Wood will actually improve and increase as a result of the proposed linkages that we are proposing with Brick Kiln Wood, and that actually it will provide for biodiversity enhancements. I won't stray too much into that because I've got Mr. Kite, who's next door to me, that can elaborate further if you wanted him to, sir. But also just on the point of ecology as well, the query came up, sir, when we were on the site visit about the cables. There are several cables crossing east-west.
It did, and for those who weren't present, the issue is essentially around the severance between Brick Kiln Wood and Folhurst Wood that has been caused by power lines moving across the gap between the two and subsequent maintenance of those easements that's occurred, with essentially the proposition being that some or all of those cables might be undergrounded, and as a consequence, the restoration of a viable green corridor was something that might occur.
Thank you, sir. I'm grateful. I can confirm that the pylons, all of the pylons that are there, are proposed to be undergrounded across the entire length of the allocation. The only query there, sir, relates to, and it's a very important element of it, is the link between Folhurst Wood and Brick Kiln Wood. It's a matter of detail, just in terms of whether the pylons are terminated on the far. I don't know if you've got the plan in front of you, sir. The plan that the programme officer may have just circulated. Yes. Okay. The far western boundary. Okay, thank you. It's that sort of almost inch distance between Brick Kiln Wood, where Folhurst Wood and Brick Kiln Wood become close into proximity with each other. You'll see, sir, that there's two little trees. The notation there, and that's the inch I'm talking about. It's presently undecided whether it's best to terminate the tower on the western boundary of that, and therefore underground immediately, going through that linkage, or whether to put the termination point on the eastern boundary of that, and then underground from there onwards. Either way, if we terminate to the west, there's then questions about the planting that can then take place above the undergrounded cables because of the importance of the linkage. Sorry, the importance of the linkage for the dormice. But if the termination point is then on the east, then it then just becomes a matter of management, as would presently be the case, in terms of maintaining that understory beneath the pylons. And so therefore it's an either-or situation at the moment. But either way, whatever happens, they will form part of the management plan to ensure the long-term security of that storage coverage. No. And sorry, so the other query that Mr. Songhurst raised on during the site visit was whether or not the principle of extending the planting, it doesn't fall relevant, I don't think, to the proposals map, because it becomes a detailed management point. But you may recall, so Mr. Songhurst was inquiring whether the illustrative planting that we were showing could travel further northwards into that green buffer, and the client's happy in principle to that, subject to the drainage people then being happy that it doesn't impact on the wider drainage strategy. So, because you'll remember that part is part of the series of linked swales. That's right. So I don't know if you have any further queries, or Mr. Kite wants to raise anything further on ecology, but.
I'll be very quick because I know time's running on, and we have discussed ecology in previous meetings, and I know they've raised some issues. I think the general thrust of what I said in this meeting this morning was that in 2010, the town was told we were having 600 houses. The PPF, the NPPF said, look, if you're going to build houses anywhere, then you must find the least ecologically damaging site. The site next to Folhurstwood is the most ecologically damaging. We all went round with a view that there were 600 houses being built, and all today has been, nobody knows how many houses are being built, but it seems to be ramping up all the time, and so we don't know what's going on these three sites.
Okay.
But I'm just going over what I said before, really.
Yeah, and which we need to have a caution over for reasons of which everybody in this room will be well aware. I think, turning back to Berkeley, I'm not going to ask for a detailed ecological response. We've had a day on the agenda where we've looked at ecological impact, and this was one of the sites that we looked at for obvious reasons. We've also had a site inspection. We've got a developer who has examined issues of possible mitigation, but those are largely ones that would be brought through by way of a master plan and by way of preparation of a planning application. I hear what you say, Mr. Songhurst, which is that you still, and other members of the community still, have broader concerns about process.
It comes to the heart, as you've heard from us, that we doubt some of the information we'll be giving. And it comes to the crux that we're not being given the true answer as to how many houses are being built. And if you can't get that truth in that very critical issue, then you can see as a community we have doubts on the other information we're being told. And I'm sure that in many, many planning applications and meetings you have, it comes down to a question of trust. And if we can't get that question of trust as to how many houses are being built, why should we trust all the rest of what we're being told about drainage and everything else as well?
Thank you very much. I'm prepared to leave it rest there because I think we know what we're talking about here, and it's concerns in the community about the nature and scale of and the change in the proposed housing allocation, rather than the site specifics or the detail, which we've already examined at quite some thoroughness. Okay, in which case, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to move us on, and I was testing whether there were any points that anybody still wished to raise in relation to the fourth discussion point on the agenda, and we'd, I think, resolved that there weren't. But we now have two.
With respect, sir, I wanted to answer one of the issues from Berkeley Homes referring to Paddockwood Town Council before we moved up.
Right, apologies.
That refers to Paddockwood Town Council policy that you referred to. The present policy, as I understand it, the Bansal Road site was the least preferred site by Town Council because Paddock Town Council owns Fowlhurst Wood.
Which is noted. Okay, I am going to propose that we move on because time is very short. I'm seeing nobody immediately raising Toblerones on item 4. So can we move to item 5, which are changes to policy wordings? Now here, what I was going to suggest that we did was actually to reverse the normal order of having the council go last, because the council have set out in the circulated document PS/37, apologies, wrong document, PS/47, that's why I was going wrong. It's the wrong 7. 47, which is the statement on matter F, Paddock Wood allocations, have set out a number of proposed changes to policy as originally submitted. And I thought it would be helpful if they explained those in summary terms, and I then seek interventions from other representors. Mr. Hinton or Mr. Tofts?
Yes, thank you, sir. I'll keep this very brief. I've talked already about changes to ALPW1, the sort of town centre site, and the reasons behind those changes. As regards the other changes, it was an attempt, the proposed changes, to bring more clarity to the policy, and also we are in a slightly different situation here where we have discussions going on planning applications, and we now have a greater level of detail. So the changes proposed are an attempt to kind of pin down the particular infrastructure requirements that would be required from each of the sites, but also the sites collectively. So these are now set out in more detail as bullet points, and particular references to places or particular requirements. Medical centre, for example, are highlighted, and the intention behind this is to provide more clarity for both for local people who have expressed these concerns about infrastructure, but also for the developers of the sites, so that there can be no confusion about what sites should contribute what.
If we look at the changes to the proposals map very briefly there, we've got the introduction of landscape buffer proposals in what you're now suggesting would be PW 3A, which is the church farm site. Now there seems to be not quite a one-to-one relationship. Not that there necessarily has to be, but not quite a one-to-one relationship with the likely land requirements for, say, for example, the detention basins that were being proposed on that site. I just wanted to explore whether it was an intention to include within the buffer sufficient land to carry out the drainage works and include that as part of a broader landscape scheme, or whether you just see that as being picked up separately.
Thank you, sir. We did discuss this in the break amongst ourselves and also with the relevant developer representatives. And on reflection, we feel that given the changes to the policy and the manner in which we have separated out the bullet points, in particular those bullet points that in some way refer to flood zone and landscape buffer, we were of the opinion that wording is clear enough in itself in terms of the intent, and therefore, unless there were any other matters that you were concerned about in terms of the annotation, it was going to be our suggestion that we remove the annotation from the proposals map and rely on the wording of the policy rather than trying to draw a line. Yes.
Which was essentially a concern. And to be fair, that would also take the approach to the site back to the approach before the change, in terms of the annotation around landscape buffer. Okay. Now, who wants to speak to this item? I know Mr. Corse does. CPRE, Paddock Wood Labour Party. No Town Council? No. Okay, I'm going to ask Mr. Corse to start. I'll then come to Mr. Moon, and then I'll come to CPRE.
Before we come to the open space buffer, I'd like to ask the Council about the Paddock Wood flood alleviation study.
Can you just speak slightly more directly into the microphone?
Okay, I'd like to ask the Council about the flood alleviation study, which in document 3.28, which was the amended local plan, they state in table 2 that this has informed the DPD, but I can find no changes in the DPD as a result of the flood alleviation study. So, one, I'd like to ask the Council what changes have actually occurred and how they've been reflected, because it is the most recent study of flooding and mitigation effects, and it does talk about the attenuation ponds and the fact that in times of extreme weather they will just inundate local adjacent properties. Okay.
I will ask the Council to pick up all of these points at the end. I'll make clear.
In January 2013, the Environment Agency sent an email to the Borough Council which states, this is for Church Farm, we would have no objection from a flood risk perspective to development at this site, but recommend no highly or more vulnerable forms of development as described in Table 2 of the Technical Guidance for the MPPF, located within areas shown to be within flood zone 2 or 3 as shown in the agency flood map, or shown to be at risk of surface water flooding as shown on map 9 of the Paddock Wood Surface Management Plan. Now, I've heard a lot of talk about flood zone 3B, but nothing about map 9 of the Surface Water Management Plan or flood zone 2. I would expect that that information is still relevant, and therefore the open space buffer should cover those areas. And if you look at the maps that cover those areas, they're far more extensive than the open space buffer provided currently in the new proposals map. Get it the right way up, it might help. So flood zone 2 and 3 goes a long way down the western boundary of the site, next to Dimmock Close, as well as large areas along the top. And the Surface Water Management Plan 1 covers a large area at the base of that field that we looked at on the site visit, where we saw some water that has flooded 3 years running, and that's certainly not covered by the open space buffer. Okay. So one would assume that the information has not been taken on board, because the open space buffer and the attenuation ponds are all in the wrong place.
Okay, that's a very clear submission, and that's one that the Council can pick up when others have made theirs.
Thank you, sir. As I see it, the landscape buffer zone is designed to mitigate any drainage issues in that particular area and at Master's Court Lane. My problem is, an issue is, as with holding ponds, who's responsible for the maintenance of this zone that will need to be managed to make sure it is working efficiently in the future?
And CPRE.
I'm afraid I'm going to harp on about parking again. The new wording proposed by the Council for allocation PW1 seems to be even weaker than the wording previously proposed. We are talking about the redevelopment of the main public car park in Paddock Wood. And they're now saying that at least the same provision of existing public parking, unless this can be re-provided at a suitable alternative location within the town centre boundary. Well, I don't see any suitable alternative locations coming forward. And it certainly doesn't take account of taking the allocations document as a whole, the extra pressure on public parking that is going to arise from these 3 massive new developments on the periphery of Paddock Wood, and they are on the periphery. So not everybody is going to be able to walk or cycle to the centre of Paddock Wood from those areas. There will be the elderly, there will be people with shopping, etc., etc. So we need a much stronger wording, including increased public parking in the town centre, not at least as much unless we can find it somewhere else. Turning to the other wordings, they do seem to be a bit better as regards public facilities and some of the, a little bit more detailed. But we still seem to have this exploring things rather than actually commitment to provide. And I believe that the community needs to see more certainty about what will actually be provided, because otherwise we could find ourselves in the same sort of situation that we are, for example, when the Transfeser depot was done many years ago now, and we were promised that the what is now the A228 would be upgraded, and we're still waiting for that. So we'd like to see some certainty in the allocations policies.
Okay. And does that bring you to the end of your observations? Now, Mr. Corse.
The open space buffer was designed to move housing to the southern and western edge of the site. Well, the western edge is exactly where flood zone 2 and the surface water collects, so it's in the wrong place as such.
Okay. Now, before I come to the council, in order that they can do this efficiently in the light of views from all others, I'm going to go to the agencies and then I'm going to go to the development interests. If I can start with the Environment Agency, then go to Southern Water.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'll refer to the email which you mentioned, January 2013, which recommended no development in flood zone 2 or 3 or the surface water flood in map 9, I believe it is. I think I was probably the author of that email, and I maintain what I said in that, so I do concur. If I just get a bit of background to that, flood zone 3 represents the area of flooding at risk from fluvial sources, and tidal, but that's not relevant here, but of fluvial sources. So it doesn't show the area of risk from surface water flooding, poor drainage, ponding, that type of thing. which is why I recommended map 9 also be included. And I think from memory, when the strategic flood risk assessment was done, flood zone 2 was drawn up in there to replicate the area where known flooding had occurred, but was not shown to be an area within flood zone 3. So that area of flood zone 2 covered that area, which I think is similar to the area of map 9. And it is particular reference to that northwest corner adjacent to Dimmock Close, which is partly shown to be in the landscape area. So just to confirm, I would stand by that email which was sent in January 2013. It's also been mentioned that the ponds may be in the wrong place, the proposed attenuation pond and flood storage ponds. Normally we have attenuation ponds to accommodate the surface water drainage, but in this particular case they're proposed to have a joint function, mainly providing some of the flood mitigation as well, and so to store some of that fluvial flooding from the watercourses as well as the surface water drainage. So this has been chosen by the developer to act in this way. Both the Environment Agency and KCC Flood and Drainage team have tried to encourage the structures for collecting surface water runoff from the development to be further back from that northern boundary and away from the area of the flood zone, purely because it is good practice to have your surface water collection features in an area which is not at risk of flooding. It's good practice to do that when it's reasonable and practical to do so. And I would maintain, because of the size of this site, it is practical to do so. However, because of their dual function as also flood mitigation structures and collecting fluvial flood water, they do have to be in a certain location. So it's difficult to say that the basins shouldn't be in that area. For their floods, for the flood mitigation function, they do have to be in that area. But for attenuation of runoff, they don't. And so consideration might be needed to split them up.
Well, that was going to be my next question. A joint function approach. Are you content with it?
I mean, to a certain extent, this is down to the detailed planning application.
But there is that, and I'm also conscious of the fact that we're in a world where the council are saying that maybe now they'll take the landscape buffer notation away completely, which I have to give careful consideration to. But clearly there is a dissonance between an approach that suggests that all of that provision would be in areas shown in the landscape buffer on the proposer's map, because from what you've put to me, that couldn't be done.
It would be preferable for quite a lot of the surface water drainage infrastructure to be outside of that buffer area.
Okay, I hear what you say. Do you want to add anything to it, or are you complete?
Not on that particular point. There's a question about maintenance, which I'm happy to answer. Government produced guidance which was published in March. It is called the Non-Statutory Technical Guidance on Sustainable Drainage Systems, which all developments of this size have to comply with. And it requires them to have a long-term maintenance plan for their sustainable drainage infrastructure, which, as part of the planning application, KCC flood drainage team would be consulted on that, and they would need to ensure that a maintenance programme is going to be in place. Thank you.
Southern Water.
Thank you. I'm afraid I haven't been able to review the proposed amendments that the Council has put forward, but I just wanted to confirm that Southern Water is seeking policy changes in line with our written statement to yourself.
Indeed. And just to be clear on those, those were additions to both PW3 and PW4. The development shall provide a connection to the sewage system at the nearest the same specific reference that you'd sought in relation to areas in Royal Tunbridge Wells where there had been concerns about sewerage system capacity.
That's correct.
Now, obviously, Council can pick up their position on that when I return to them. Developer interests. Ryden clearly want to speak. Is it just Ryden? Because this is all very much Church Farm. Ryden.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Just a number of points quickly. First of all, obviously we have proposed policy revisions here. We are separating Church Farm and Maskell's Court Farm, which were a single allocation, into two allocations, and the Council is proposing that. That proposal has only just been introduced, and we would like to have the opportunity to comment upon it, because the infrastructure requirements, particularly in relation to highways, are more detailed and prescriptive than they were. And I noted that you set a consultation process for the changes to ALPW1. And I was going to suggest that you do likewise for the changes to the Church Farm allocation.
I'll ask the Council to respond to that, whether they're happy to have that joined on, but in principle the arrangements can be made.
Okay, I'll move to my other points then. In terms of Flood Zone 2, just wanted to make clear that we're not proposing any residential development within Flood Zone 2. I know the policy at the moment refers only to Flood Zone 3, but that is the nature of our proposals. There's no development proposed in Flood Zone 2. The location of the attenuation ponds has been raised a number of times. There's no doubt in terms of our technical work that those attenuation ponds are located in the best position to address flood risk. That's a necessary and appropriate location for them. It's the best location to intercept and store floodwater close to the highest areas of flood risk. But I know some points here have been made by the Environment Agency, and I think it might be appropriate for my colleague Paul Dakin to make a comment on that.
Thank you.
Thanks
yes, just
much.
in relation to the locations and basins, as mentioned before, the concept has always been to try and capture overland flow that's arising from the adjacent watercourses. Hence the reason we've tried to give them connectivity into the existing floodplain. Obviously, they are dual purpose, and the intent is to use a proportion of the ponds as a means of storing water that's developed from floods derived from the residential development. What's proposed there at the moment isn't in detailed design, and there could be variants on there, but as it stands at the moment, that is a provision that is intended to allocate enough space to store the water that's run off, and also to any extra over that is currently within the central pond that's shown to store surface water, that is then still available to contribute to overland flows from other sources. So while there's been discussion that that there's 2 ponds that will be allocated to overland storage and 1 pond to residential drainage, the fact that they're all connected within the floodplain means that any extra storage that was necessity by the earthworks profile would then be afforded to provide additional mitigation for neighbouring paddock wood.
Putting this in simple terms, the land requirement for it is not represented by the landscape buffer as shown on the proposed amended plan, and realistically you want to come back at some point in writing to make some observations about whether to put that in or where to put it in.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to. I mean, I'm talking from a technical standpoint, but realistically, the plan hasn't dictated where we wanted our ponds.
No.
So, what has dictated that is effectively our putting residential dwellings in a safe place and making provision for drainage and betterment elsewhere. What has gone on the following step in terms of planning it hasn't informed that design. The design led that in effect. So whatever happens from here on in, it's provided we've got those areas, whether they're allocated as POS or any other means, it's still the necessity for the development.
Just to conclude then, so
Indeed.
I suppose it occurs to me really that it's an application issue, really, rather than one for you to address in terms of the policy requirement.
Okay.
In terms of exactly the form those attenuation basins take in the location.
Indeed. Okay, I've heard you on that. Now, Persimmon and then Berkeley.
Thank you, sir. I'll keep it brief. It's really just to cover the wider revised wording of the policy, in particular with regards to our site at Maskell's Court Road. We're in agreement and did suggest the splitting of the Church Farm site and our site into separate policy allocations, so I'm in support of that. We haven't got any notable concerns with regards to the revised wording. However, there's a couple of queries with regards to some of the detailed requirements that we'd still like some clarification with the council, so we'd support Mr Newton's suggestion that there's a further period for comments on that, just to clarify that situation. The one outstanding area that we put written submissions in on relates to the open space buffer within our site, which is more of, there's landscape reasoning behind that, and the fact that our planning application that's currently with the council identifies a slightly different area. That's obviously been informed by a detailed landscape visual impact assessment and agreed with the officers at the council. So our suggestion is that that is actually more informed than what's proposed in a generalised proposals map. So either it needs to change to reflect that, or the wording needs to clarify it. Is just very illustrative. I understand the council are proposing changes in that respect, but they can confirm. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Berkeley.
Just quickly, sir, just to confirm that we support the proposed changes to the wording. I think it provides more detail for us all. I think it reflects and benefits from the discussions that have taken place since March 2015, and it provides for an improved policy and more coordination of the infrastructure along with the other allocated sites that are proposed to come forward. So then I think it's benefited and provides for a fuller explanation.
Thank you very much. Now, before we move away from developer interests, there's just a check back to an earlier point in the hearings that I want to carry out, because when we dealt with matters arising in actions from the November hearings, there was a document, TWBC PS 37, which dealt with the council's position on 5-year housing land supply. Now, I'm conscious that some folk were here when we had those discussions, but I believe Ryden Homes were not. Now, I just simply then need to check. Church Farm.
To interrupt, could you turn your microphone on?
Thank you very much. It keeps turning itself off, actually, which is a little disconcerting. I'll just start that again. Church Farm is relied upon as providing a cumulated total of 262 projected completions by the end of 2020-21, and that is being included in the council's current calculation of 5-year housing land supply. There's an equivalent projection for Maskell's Court Road, but that's already been discussed. So if I could draw your attention to that, and if you're, I fully accept you won't want to respond to it extempore, but if you could maybe respond by the time that we will set, prospectively the 24th of December.
Yeah, I think we've already been asked to do that, so actually I think that's currently with us.
Excellent.
So
good.
we will respond to you on that.
Good. Fine. Barclay Holmes.
Sorry, sir, just to confirm or advise you, if you weren't aware of it from yesterday, that we will be writing to the council following the comments I made yesterday regarding Hawkenbury Farm, regarding its availability, suitability and deliverability. I could make the similar comments now regarding this site, but I will be writing to the council regarding this site as well, in terms of the context you've just been talking about.
Indeed. Well, again, it's feeling to me as though there's a need for some sort of sweep-up by the council that delivers all of that sort of commentary to me, probably by the 24th of December. Okay. Response from the council.
Thank you, sir. I think we can be quick on these matters. As far as the parking issue has been raised again, I think the answer I gave earlier in proceedings still stands, and we wouldn't wish to add anything in commentary on parking in the town centre. As far as the point made about one of the original flood studies, just to confirm, as I indicated earlier on in the proceedings, clearly this is part of the evidence base, and it has influenced the allocation and the proposals going forward. It may be that those making comments think it should have had a greater influence, but nonetheless it has had an influence in the allocation policy. As far as the proposal maps are concerned, and the point made in terms of Maskell's Court Road, Site 3B as it is now, I think the council's position would be if it is now able to identify a more accurate line based on the more detailed work that has been done, we would be looking to revise the buffer boundary to reflect that, and obviously that can be confirmed in the correspondence that's going to take place. As far as the buffer in respect of Site 3A is concerned, and the comment I made earlier, I still feel that the changes to the policy and the way that is now set out is such that we could revert back to the original intention and not to show any delineated buffers on that particular site. And my final point really is whilst I understand the concerns that are being made by the local residents and community groups, I do feel that whilst we have many benefits of the fact that the pre-application and application stages have moved on, one of the disbenefits in this sort of forum is that we're trying to carry out a development management process in a local plan forum, and I think that's why the discussion has sort of got into detail where it has.
Indeed, and one of the things that I'm continually having to do is to kind of caution myself against slipping into that process. Because it is critically important that the discretion open to the local planning authority to make its development management decision under a plan is not unduly interfered with by the plan-making process. So, Mr. Corse, one final observation.
My observation is that neither Ryden nor Tunbridge Wells Borough Council appear to have made much comment about the flood alleviation study or have changed their plans as a result of it. And it's the most recent evidence about the situation and mitigation.
And I hear that comment. Okay. What I'm going to suggest then, in terms of timings, is that the Council has made some policy changes set out within its paper 47. Some folk have asked for a right to make further observations to me in writing on those. The council itself wants to change, potentially, landscape buffer boundaries on... It's turned itself off again. Landscape buffer boundaries on Maskell's Court Farm, and potentially remove again landscape buffer boundaries on the Ridenholme site. So, to facilitate all that happening, can I suggest that the council makes any final revisions to the appendices to paper 47 by the 11th? Does anybody else who is interested in and wants to comment on the revisions as a complete package at that point? Can I just ask that device be silenced? Thank you very much. That anybody else who wants to comment on those revisions as a package, be they developer, local community or agency, can do so by the 24th of December. And that if the council then feel that there are remaining matters on which they wish to make comments as local planning authority in conclusion, that they do so in writing by the 6th. So it's the same dates, the same procedure as the other written procedures that we put in place. Is everybody happy with that? Which then takes us finally to the last agenda item for Paddock Wood, which is asking the question that has to be asked, whether there is any need for any additional allocations or consideration of housing and mission sites in this settlement. Is there anybody wishing to speak at all on that item? Mr. Corse.
Due to that, and probably everybody else around this side of the table, is there's no need for any more allocation sites to be, because we don't need as many houses as
yes.
that.
No, I'd taken the thrust of that from the very clearly put arguments that have been placed before me earlier, which is why I didn't think it was a matter that would delay us for long. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that has brought us to a concluding point in terms of the hearing of the matters for Paddock Wood. I trust everybody considers that they have been fully and fairly heard. I would like to thank everybody for their involvements, particularly noting that it is, difficult for an affected community to have contentious public conversations of this nature sometimes. So I'm very, very grateful for everybody who's come with a spirit of goodwill to participate in frank, full and open conversations about these issues of concern. So thank you to everybody. I suggest we take 5 minutes to allow a reshuffling of the chairs, and then if the Cranbrook teams could assemble. Are here. So I'll just make some very brief preliminary remarks by welcoming those who are new to these hearings to the Council Chamber. My name is Ryn Smith. I've been appointed on behalf of the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government to examine the Tunbridge Wells Allocation Local Plan. To my left at her desk is Lynette Duncan, who's the Programme Officer, who I'm sure most of you will have corresponded with, if not met in person. Do feel free to ask her for any assistance that you need in relation to the management of this hearing process. Firstly, an apology is due to parties attending with an interest in Cranbrook because we are significantly later than the 2 p.m. that was programmed for today's business. 2 matters intervened. One was Paddock Wood being controversial and taking a little more time than I had allowed. The second was that we had an unscheduled fire alarm in the middle of the Paddock Wood session, and we lost approximately 20 minutes to vacating the chamber. So I'm very grateful to you for bearing with me in that delay. The other bad news, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, is that I have been informed by the Council that today, of all days, we don't have scope to extend the hearing. So we are going to have to be relatively on point to move through the agendaed business for Cranbrook. So, the first thing I'm going to do, given that we do have people who haven't been in this room and this building before is just very briefly to say, ladies' toilets are to my right immediately through the door in the lobby. Gents' toilets, if they're required, out through the lobby to the head of the staircase, turn left onto the committee corridor, halfway down the corridor on the left. I trust there will be no more fire events, but if the alarm does sound, it is the real thing. We exit through either of the double doors onto the grand staircase and straight out by the entrance onto the road, and the council staff who are here will be our marshals if we need to leave the building. You'll have seen I'm using a microphone, and you will no doubt have deduced that everything is being recorded, and there will be a full record placed on the council's website of all of the discussions in these hearings. Now, I am skipping through a number of other preliminary matters, and I will then move first to the council, because they're in the middle, but they need to introduce themselves first, and then I'll start at this end with development interests, and then I'll move to this side of the table for introductions. So if the council can introduce themselves, please.
Thank you, sir. Kelvin Hinton, Planning Policy Manager with the Borough Council.
My name is Adrian Toffs. I am Planning Policy Team Leader with Tunbridge Wells Borough Council.
Thank you very much.
And my name is David Scully. I'm the Landscape and Biodiversity Officer at Tunbridge Wells Borough Council.
Thank you, Mr. Scully.
Hello, I'm Mark Busey from Countryside Properties. I'm Senior Planning Manager.
Thank you very much.
Yes, David Bedford from DHA Planning. Apologies, I'm slightly croaky, so if anything I say is not clear, do let me know. Just to say, we're actually representing Countryside Properties and Persimmon jointly, so anything we say is a joint representation, unless otherwise stated.
Okay, hence the combination of Toblerones.
James Amos from Persimmon Homes.
Thank you very much.
I'm Victoria Swift from Persimmon Homes as well.
Okay. Now, moving to the other side of the room. CPRE.
Elizabeth Aikenhead from CPRE, Tunbridge Wells District.
Thank you very much.
And Sally Marsh from the High Weald AOB unit.
Thank you very much. And thank you for attending on this occasion, because this is an occasion on which AOMB impact is obviously one of the matters that I had identified for examination. Now, I'm just going to check to see if there are any preliminary matters that anybody wishes to raise before we move into the substance of discussions. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say, following the site visit yesterday, we discussed the fact it would be useful to have an aerial photograph with the local plan overview onto it. Working with the council, we've been able to do that, and we can hand those out if it's convenient. It just might be useful to have it in front of us as we discuss.
I am utterly astonished. I had been prepared to suggest that you might do that, say, by about the 11th of December. But if it's here and now...
Yeah, if you're I'll take that from there.
Somebody was up at midnight.
This man, I can take no credit.
I would love one. Just to fill people in, this arose from discussions on the site visit where I was asked to be shown the physical boundaries of the allocated land, and I noted that it was actually different in a number of respects from the boundaries of the land ownerships shown on plans held by the various consultants for the landowners. And so locating certain features and trying to decide whether those features were within or without the allocation actually became a little more difficult on site than it sometimes is. And this was suggested as a technical solution that would enable us very rapidly to work out what was inside and what was outside the allocation. It's not aiming to be a document that would form part of the plan itself. It's merely information by overlaying the proposed allocation with an aerial photograph. is everybody content that we refer to this? Excellent. Well, once again, thank you very much for taking the trouble to have that produced. Now, there's one other preliminary matter that I wish to refer to very briefly before we move to the main agenda. Simply to note that in another very dim and distant life, many, many years ago, Mr. Amos and I did work in adjoining teams in the London Borough of Bromley planning department. I think it must be 20 years ago. 20 years ago. Yes, 20 years ago. Oh, Lord. But certainly, we haven't, we're not regularly corresponding friends or business associates or anything of that nature. I just thought I should make a clear declaration of the fact that he is known to me, but no more than that, and in a professional capacity and going back over very many years. Does anybody have any concerns or observations to make about that? None. Okay, let's move then to the main agenda. Now, the first way that I'm going to deal with this, I think, is to ask a general question about the sites and the allocations proposed in the Cranbrook chapter and ask whether there are observations that people feel they need to make drawing on the written material that don't relate to the Crane Valley. So they're not in relation. So there's something to do with the town centre or one of the other allocations. I just want to ask if anybody wants to talk about any of the rest of Cranbrook. No. The reason why I want to ask that is because I then want to be able to focus the rest of the agenda tightly onto the Crane Valley without having to worry about other sites. So if everybody's content there, we can then move to, first of all, the consideration of the proposed Crane Valley allocation, which I've, in very summary terms in the agenda, set out as, is the site proposed to be allocated sound? But in terms of the detail underlying that, matter G, main issue 1, are the matters that I'm referring to. Now, I'm open as to how we start the discussion of this. I think there would be something to be said in this instance for allowing the landowner interests to put their position on the table, tell their story, and then CPRE and High Weald have a complete reminded and up-to-date position on which to make their contributions. Does that commend itself to this side of the table? And then we'll come to the council at the very end. Okay. So who wishes to lead?
Thank you. Again, I'll keep this nice and brief, particularly because my voice is going, but genuinely, I think we have to take our hats off to the council for planning positively on this site. Going back as far as the core strategy period, where a very comprehensive evidence base was produced, a need was identified and planned for in terms of allocating a suitable level of growth for Cranbrook. It is a sensitive site. It is the best site in Cranbrook, and I think the council's prepared the relevant evidence base to demonstrate that the allocation is sound. From a landowner perspective, there's two landowners. Both are willing to work together to provide a comprehensive master plan scheme. It's deliverable. It's deliverable within, certainly within, to commence development within the 5-year period. And although there is some outstanding objection to the allocation, the majority and the principle of providing 300 units in total in the AOMB was discussed and found sound through the core strategy process. Exceptional circumstances were demonstrated and again accepted by the inspector who examined that strategic document.
And we feel that this is just a very sensible and well-planned allocation to ensure that the core strategy target is delivered. Obviously, there's the much wider issues in terms of where future need goes and how much further development goes to Cranbrook, but certainly for the most part this plan should be focused on delivering the core strategy requirement, which it does. So we congratulate the Council for planning positively and preparing the relevant evidence base to take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, clearly there are elements of this proposal that are not without potential concern, because it does, as I indicated in my main issue 1, represent a significant incursion into the area of outstanding natural beauty, and the site was also scored negatively in terms of efficient land use, natural and built environment and biodiversity impacts. So I guess probably the best way to explore any remaining concerns would be to hear those drawn out. I think I'll go to the CPRE first and then come to the high-wheeled AOMB unit afterwards. What I may also ask the Council to address is to briefly summarise their consideration of the MPPF paragraph 116 considerations that they've set out in their written statement, and whether anything that they hear, particularly from this side of the table, changes anything that they've written. So, CPRE.
I'm probably one of the few people in this room who has been present for all the process dating back to when we were first considering the issues and options for the core strategy. And I recall that at that stage we had an allocation that that the borough was required to produce, and the decision was taken that it should be concentrated in the areas which were most able to support it through their services. And that really dictated the allocation, not really the question of how many houses does Cranbrook need, but that it was the borough was expected to provide a certain quantum of housing, and it was decided to allocate it accordingly. Now, the rural area is already well over its allocation in terms of supply. It appears that the borough is going to substantially overperform in terms of its total allocation, judging by the papers that we've seen, because the borough's been taking a conservative line. We've heard from lots of developers that they confidently expect to complete as expected by the Borough Council. And this site is the most difficult site of the ones that are proposed to be allocated. It is beautiful countryside, as you saw yesterday, and that countryside is going to be lost forever. And it may not be necessary, because there is the potential for other brownfield sites to come forward. There's a major brownfield site in an adjoining parish which hasn't yet come forward, but we think it's not going to be perhaps very long off. There are all the windfalls that continue to come forward, and the changing government policy on agricultural buildings, which means that any agricultural building that's surplus to requirements can now be converted to dwellings, regardless of its architectural merit, will make a difference and will mean that there will continue to be housing coming forward as windfalls in the rural area. And we believe that a much smaller development, as suggested in our original submissions, should be what goes forward rather than this large development which is going to totally alter the character of that particular and rather special area.
So drawing that together, in your proposition, too big, in the wrong place, and having regard to what you think will be a broad over-fulfilment in terms of housing provision, not necessary.
Yes, that summarises it, except that we do accept that the brick kiln farm bit is previously developed land, and it's more hidden. So a smaller development would be acceptable.
Okay. Just remind me, because if you have, I'm not immediately recalling it to mind, have you set that out as a spatial proposal? You haven't? Okay.
No.
Yeah, no, I didn't think I'd seen something.
I think we might need the Borough Council's help to do that.
Well, clearly, somebody has the skills to do things very quickly if they need to. No, thank you very much for that. I had one other question that arose, and that related to the suggestion that there is, in inverted commas, a major brownfield site in a nearby parish. Which is, if it's one of the ones that's been considered in the site templates process.
It's not, and I think it's, well, I suppose everybody knows that the prison is currently closed.
The prison?
The Blantyre House prison.
Right, I didn't know.
We don't know yet what the prison authorities are going to do with it, but we do know that it's closed for the foreseeable future.
Okay. Right. Are there other matters that you want to draw out from your written material, or are you happy to let the rest in writing?
I'll leave the rest to what we've already said in writing, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, high-wheeled AOMB unit, and here really, this is, as much as anything, an exercise about seeing the colour of somebody's eyes on the proposition of the appropriate balance being struck between the needs of the AONB in policy terms and the need for housing.
Okay. It's our view that the site allocations DPD in relation to Cranbrook policy ALCR4 is not consistent with national policy because great weight hasn't been given to conserving AOB landscape and scenic beauty as required by MPPF Para 115, and I can go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. Obviously, in addition to that, we've got Para 116 of the MPPF, which states quite clearly that major development in the AOB should be refused unless exceptional circumstances are demonstrated through the application of 3 tests. Now, it's our view those tests haven't been carried out appropriately in this case. Now, obviously, we don't contest the first of those cases, which is that there's a need for 250 houses in Cranbrook. We don't have the evidence to do that. But we do think that the further 2 tests, which are equally important, have not been properly carried out. In addition to that, it's our view that the sustainability appraisal in respect of this policy is neither robust nor credible, and therefore the DPD policy is not justified, and I can go into that a little bit later. And I just wanted to add that National Planning Practice Guidance makes it quite clear again that planning should have regard to the statutory AONB management plan, and that should be taken account in the preparation of local plans. And in our view, the management plan hasn't been taken into account. Now, obviously, the management plan is a statutory document. Tunbridge Wells, the council have adopted that plan, or have adopted it every 5 years from 2004, setting out their policy for the management of the AONB and the discharging of all of their functions in relation to it. So I can explain that in a little bit more detail in response to both Persimmon's comments, or the developers' comments, and the council's further issues. If I can, please, I'll take 115 first, because that sets the context for 116.
Indeed.
So if we're looking at the documents cited by the council as demonstrating that the AONB has been considered, that is the landscape and ecological evaluation, let's take that first, of Cranbrook, prepared in 2012. This is a really good explanation of the landscape impact in regards local landscape character. It doesn't necessarily deal with AONB issues. Out of the 4 pages devoted to the site itself, there are 4 lines on the AONB. The AONB management plan isn't mentioned. Some AONB features are mentioned, but not all of them. And what we're not seeing is an assessment of significance, what features are significant on that site, nor the harm that's likely to arise if the development takes place. Taking both documents together, that's the landscape and ecological evaluation for Cranbrook 2012 and the landscape character assessment and capacity study, which is 2009. Obviously, neither of those take account of new evidence, which was made available to the Council in 2014 in the form of the historic landscape characterisation for Cranbrook. Now, historic landscape characterisation, or HLC, the document for Cranbrook was prepared by Dr. Nicola Bannister, who is a landscape archaeologist. It was prepared following national guidance and a peer-reviewed methodology by what is now Historic England, and it was held up as an example of good practice by Historic England. That document identifies some of the allocated fields as being early post-medieval in origin. That means that in terms of their pattern, and particularly their enclosure pattern, they predate 1600. And that is significant because the AONB management plan, which is a statutory document, identifies the pattern of medieval fields as being a core component of natural beauty. So as part of the AONB management plan, the fields are a core component of natural beauty, those are medieval fields, and there are a set of objectives and targets around conserving them, which the Council has signed up to. Looking a little bit further at the sort of support that the AONB has been given in the documents provided, in terms of, and I think it's the landscape and ecological evaluation, it appears as if what's being said is that the benefits brought by the potential, or possibly brought by the development to local assets, effectively, such as the Crane Valley Nature Reserve, are seen to equate to or even outweigh the demonstrable and actual harm that's been done to a major greenfield site in the AONB, a national asset. And in our view, that is sort of incorrect in terms of policy. Just turning to the sustainability appraisal for a minute. Again, there's some interesting detail in the sustainability appraisal. The AONB management plan is not mentioned, and the AONB is not part of the sustainability appraisal. Natural and built environment constitute a single criteria out of the 15 criteria applied to the various sites. So looking at the site itself, in the context of giving great weight to the AONB as required by Para 115, we can see that the site scores only 2 positives out of the 15 criteria. The other 13 are either 0, unknown, or negative, of which there are 3 double negatives. Now, the double negatives and the damage to the AONB and the environment are recognised in the commentary around the sustainability appraisal, but not necessarily translated into justification and the site allocations document, in which the AONB or the AONB management plan is not actually mentioned. If you look at the cumulative impact of all the policies in Cranbrook in the sustainability appraisal, and you focus on the natural environment criteria of the, and I've forgotten how many policies there are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Out of the 10 policies, the cumulative score appears to be an unknown. And yet, certainly if I add up the various scores, we get at the minimum a negative, more likely a double negative. So what the cumulative impact document appears to be saying is that despite the destruction of a significant greenfield site in the AONB, the cumulative impact of all those policies are actually unknown, and we think that's wrong. And I suppose our question to the Council is, if that was properly scored as a negative or double negative, what would that mean for the site allocation selection process? Okay, so turning, if I can go on to 116, if that's okay. Looking at paragraph 116, which obviously the developer said is a important paragraph. As I said, we do not dispute the housing allocation. We understand the need for affordable housing in the rural areas. That's taken as read. But we are concerned that the other 2 tests haven't been properly carried out. I noticed that in the response to the inspector's questions, the developers are suggesting that Cranbrook is somehow similar to Hawkhurst Highgate Hill, and that a recent appeal decision suggested that the development can go ahead. And I really wanted to explain why Cranbrook is not the same as Hawkhurst Highgate Hill in the context of para sort of 116. So if I can do that then, so Cranbrook's a small rural town. It has a population of 6,000 to 7,000, and it lies very close to the boundary of the AONB. The allocation of 200 to 250 houses means an increase in population of about 9 to 10%. But more significantly for the AONB, the built area of Cranbrook is likely to increase under the current site allocation to 20%. And that is a major development by any imagination. And here para 116 applies. So if we take the first part of the second test of para 116, which is the scope for developing or meeting the allocation outside of the AONB. Unlike Hawkhurst Highgate Hill, Cranbrook lies close to the edge of the AONB. The church, the primary school, the secondary school are within 1 mile of the AONB boundary. That mile is built up. It's a major road, there's a pavement, and it links Cranbrook to its satellite settlement, Willesey Pound, which is on the edge of the AONB. The hamlet is closer to Staplehurst Station than Cranbrook, and since within the Cranbrook policies there is nothing which is looking at supporting increased employment in the area, it's quite likely and it's reasonable to think that people moving into this new development are likely or quite possibly heading straight for Staplehurst Station and the fast train to London. So in our view, given the proximity of the boundary of the AONB to Cranbrook and its position close to what effectively the train line to London, it would be perfectly reasonable for the council to seek to meet the need outside the AONB. And we can't see any evidence that this has actually been considered in the documents provided to us. If we take the second test of para 116, can the need be met in some other way? Well, there are many possibilities, and some have been suggested already. Cranbrook has brownfield sites, some of which have been assessed, some haven't been. There are opportunities to increase the density of dwellings within the urban fabric. For example, there is a secondary school in Cranbrook, the Highwold Academy, which is looking to develop its buildings. There may be an opportunity to deliver some allocation at that site. It's something that Cranbrook Neighbourhood Planning Committee have considered and are talking to the school about at the moment. And obviously the allocation as it stands at the moment may prejudice those discussions. If we look at the character and origins of Cranbrook as a centre for trade and craft, what that means is Cranbrook developed later than its surrounding farmsteads and hamlets. It developed as a centre for trade and craft to serve those earlier settlements. And it seems, again, perfectly reasonable in the case of this area, looking at the character of the settlements, to consider Cranbrook and its satellite hamlets and farmsteads as a single sustainable unit. And within those additional dispersed farmsteads and hamlets, there is undoubtedly capacity for some additional dwellings. And again, we would like to see these issues looked at and considered. Given that this allocation is so significant in terms of the AONB on a greenfield site, we would expect all those alternatives to be considered before the allocation is made. So that's the sort of second test. The third test of Para 116 effectively looks at the detrimental effect that the allocation may have on the landscape and the extent to which it can be moderated. And this can't be done without reference to the AONB management plan. The management plan clearly sets out, it's a policy of the council, it clearly sets out the criteria for natural beauty against which any development can be assessed. And currently we can find no assessment of those impacts against the AONB management plan. And again, with the 4 lines out of 4 pages on Brickhilm Farm, our challenge would be, how have those various components of natural beauty been considered, and what's the impact, and how is that going to be moderated? Looking at the site template for 298 and 294, which is supposed to justify the allocation, AONB is only mentioned in relation to conditions of development. It's not mentioned in sort of just the site justification or indeed sustainability appraisal. And again, we would say, given the need to demonstrate great weight has been given to the AONB, we will expect to see those issues covered in those parts of the site allocation. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I guess and this is always a very difficult question in relation to this sort of planning process where there are statutory designations and particular tests that have to be performed in relation to them. But without making something that's already complicated even more complicated, the question in the back of my mind is whether I guess the distinction between the element of your concern that is procedural and essentially if the council were to have produced expressly a report that took the MPPF tests, set them alongside the relevant policies and justifying material from the AONB management plan and said, this is how we are testing this site, and it's a different process to the generic process that we're using for sites that are not major sites within a statutorily designated area. And they did the sums, and they came out at the end, and they still found a justification for this proposed allocation. Would you be in as loud dispute? In other words, the substance of the issues in terms of particular harm to landscape character, landscape quality, are we in a place where even if they'd done everything properly, you'd still be saying you object to the allocation of this site, or are we in a place where you just wish they'd done the job properly?
It would be nice to see the job done properly, because this is a major allocation in Area B. Having said that, the critical point for us is that part of the site demonstrates a component of natural beauty which is nationally rare, and that is medieval field systems. Not all the site demonstrates that, and it may be, as CPRA have suggested, that there is some capacity on that site. And certainly the new evidence provided by the historic landscape characterisation would support that, with the caveat that further work would need to be done on the archaeology of those areas. But certainly a smaller allocation on that site might be acceptable. In terms of meeting another requirement of the MPPF, that the character of place informs the development of a town, we would also be concerned that such a large allocation would prejudice the proper sustainable development of the town, which I know that the Neighbourhood Planning Committee are looking at, and looking at quite thoroughly at the moment. And there may be opportunities elsewhere around the village and outside the AONB to deliver that scale of allocation.
Okay, and that was then leading me to the second issue that I wanted to explore with you, which you've in part answered by reference to the reasonable proximity of the town centre to the AONB boundary. However, in terms of there being other ways of delivering housing for Cranbrook, one of the concerns that can arise in a national park or AONB setting typically is this site causes harm. But so does that site and that site and that site, and that if you look at, some of the brownfield opportunities, typically you're also looking at historic built environment assets, you're looking at archaeology, you're looking at conservation area and listed buildings and scheduled ancient monuments. And sometimes very hard decisions have to be taken in the face of the combination of all of those sorts of factors, and looking at one particular critically important and statutorily recognised value is nevertheless something that has to be moderated by a balancing with other, sometimes equally statutorily protected or equally highly significant values. And I just wanted to test that we're not in that world, in your view.
The AONB management plan recognises that settlement character is a core component of natural beauty. We are not anti-development in any way, shape or form. It's about getting the right development in the right place. And there's no doubt that many of our settlements have capacity to support the rural economy and to accommodate additional dwellings. We recognise and we know that to support a working landscape like the High Weald requires people. But in our view, this development is in the wrong place. Or this allocation is in the wrong place.
But again, without labouring a point, we're not in a situation where there might be a number of other potential solutions that would equally, if they were given the same detailed evaluation or a more detailed evaluation, turn out to be even wronger. If there is such a word.
Well, I think there's already been a number of suggestions of possible alternatives that may well meet that allocation.
Okay, and so you're moving back to brownfield, and you're moving back to peripheral hamlet.
A reduced capacity perhaps on that site, and you get discussions with the local secondary school about capacity. There are other opportunities, and the Neighbourhood Plan Committee is working on looking at those alternatives.
Okay. Right. I'm going to then move to the Council for a response to both of those sets of issues. As I have sometimes done in these hearings, where there are issues of substantial difference between different groups of parties, I've actually done an iterative process where I've actually gone back to people on the other side of an argument and then back to the person making the point of challenge, so that I can ensure that things have been fully, fairly and thoroughly thrashed out. But I'll ask the Council for a principal response before I do that.
Yes, thank you, sir. I was just going to pick up a few points that have been raised before handing over to my colleagues to my right. But reference has been made to a neighbourhood plan for Cranbrook, and we have in other evidence to this examination listed the progress with neighbourhood plans within the borough, and we haven't so far received any request for a designation of Cranbrook for a neighbourhood plan. So we are not aware of any activity in that area, which would suggest that any final neighbourhood plan is still some way off. Reference has also been made to a brownfield site, the prison, I think it is. We are not aware of any pre-application discussions on this site, and we have no evidence that it's going to come forward within the near future. It would anyway fall outside Cranbrook and within the villages and rural areas. We will be discussing villages and rural areas as part of Matter I. So, but you are aware from our evidence, sir, that we are not proposing any further allocations in the villages and rural areas because of the housing supply situation in that area. But if the prison was to come along, then it could be considered on its merits through the ordinary planning process. A lot of reference was made to brownfield potential in Cranbrook. So I would just refer you to our statement PS18 and the appendix to that statement, Table 7, shows the housing supply situation at Cranbrook, and in that table it's clear that since the start of the plan process in 2006, there have been 3 completions for dwellings in Cranbrook. So it does not suggest that there is great brownfield potential within the town. So those were the points I wanted to pick up on. And now, sir, I wanted to hand over to my colleagues for more comments on the process of preparing the plan and landscape impacts.
Thank you very much. Who will speak first? Mr. Scully?
I'll hand over to my colleague Katie McFloyd in a few moments to talk about the sustainability appraisal. But in terms of the general comments on landscape A&B management plan and the process, particularly in regard to paragraph 116, I will try and do with those. The CPRE made those very similar comments, I think, really, in terms of the alternatives and paragraph 116. In terms of the appropriate balance and so on, I'm grateful to Mrs. Marsh accepting that bullet point 1 of paragraph 116, because that, sir, is the starting point, that the need was identified through the core strategy, and that need was for Cranbrook. There were 2 allocations within the area of outstanding natural beauty, Hawkhurst and Cranbrook, that you'll be aware of. But also in terms of the first part of bullet point 2, the developing outside the designated area is quite clear with the policies that support the allocation that the need is for development close to and adjacent to the town rather than in a remote site. It's key to note here that the alternatives that are being suggested, there are no sites. I'm glad for you to sort of be aware of that yourself, but the High Ward Unit isn't proposing alternative available deliverable sites in the model that's being suggested, either as hamlets being developed or in terms of farmsteads being developed. The farmsteads are taken account of in terms of the windfalls that the local authority adopts. And indeed, the council has done what it can to encourage that through the development of a farmsteads guidance document, a supplementary planning document adopted earlier this year, which was developed with the help of the ANAB unit and English Heritage, particularly to help facilitate conservation and new development in farmsteads, but it's not seen as an alternative to large-scale site delivery. So we have aware of those issues or explored those issues, but no method or alternative sites has come forward in the whole of the process. And indeed, the High Ward Unit didn't actually comment on the core strategy and that delivery of the number of dwellings for Cranbrook. In terms of how we've then taken forward the considerations of that particular site, that comes on to the bullet point 3. And so you've been referred to CD 34.7C, the Cranbrook Landscape and Ecological Evaluation. And this document has been criticised for not dealing with A&B issues and the A&B management plan specifically. Firstly, so you would have seen my CV for this inquiry, and you'll be aware that actually until very recently I was the Vice Chair of the Officer Steering Group for the High Ward A&B unit, and have been the officer representing that unit for a number of years. I've been at this authority working in A&B since year 2000, and so fully aware of the issues of the management plan. It was myself that prepared the Cranbrook Landscape and Ecological Evaluation. There is a methodology set out in there which does say, in terms of reviewing information, data on the components of natural beauty provided by the High Ward A&B unit and any significant considerations in respect of the A&B management plan. So it says that has been reviewed as part of this document. And the fact that there's a single paragraph in the site assessment which talks about the A&B issues assumes that when one's referring to landscape views and features such as hedgerows, but we don't think of them as A&B features or components, where of course we do. We're fully cognizant of the fact we're in the area of outstanding natural beauty from that point of view. So the process that went through before this document was done was a search for sites around Cranbrook. This document looked at in landscape terms the available sites that could deliver the number of dwellings required, consistent with the policies that are set out for that delivery. So we looked at all the issues, and it doesn't say there will not be any harm. And it does not say that some benefits that the scheme may bring to features such as local nature reserves outweigh the harm to the A&B. A development like this must be harmful, and the council has always said that it's a very difficult thing. As you say, sometimes these are very difficult decisions. For the first 10 years of this authority, I spent all my time defending any kind of development on greenfield sites. In the last 5 years, I've had the very difficult job of trying to find greenfield sites, and it's a challenge that has been very testing and not undertaken lightly. In terms of this particular site, so you would have seen that it has got some features which are what we describe in landscape terms detractors, in terms of the abandoned farmstead, many elements of it quite modern, as you saw, former brick fields, and other disturbance to the ground, which is seems to be entirely modern, and a number of degraded hedgerows and features. And so in terms of what the policy and the plan is trying to do is recognise those features and seek to protect them and enhance them. And we have always stressed the importance of a landscape-led scheme, and that's why there's such strong buffers on this site, which we were looking at when we were on site. And indeed, the conservation of those features and their use within sort of recreation and conservation work can help fulfil many of the objectives in the ANB management plan. So they will indeed do that. It was also pointed out to you, sir, that this was a highly visually prominent site. I think you would have noticed yourself when you approach Cranbrook, whether you approach it from the east, the south or the north, Cranbrook doesn't stand out like many of the other settlements. And in fact, you can pass it on the A229 without even realising it's there, because of its location in the fold. And for this, I would direct you to the landscape character assessment for the borough, which clearly points this out. I'll just refer you to that. It's mentioned in the core document, the landscape and ecological evaluation. It's quoted directly, and key characteristic 8 is settlement contained within a topographical and wooded framework due to the role in landscape and aspects of land cover, buildings and settlements are usually hidden within the landscape when viewed from afar. And that's the kind of approach we're taking with this additional dwellings. We're very aware of concerns about a mass extension to Cranbrook and bolting onto the core conservation area. And indeed, the areas which we've set aside for non-development reflect that. They specifically pick up on firstly, the backlands to the high street and their importance, so that we can separate the new development from the old quite clearly and provide and protect the features that are there. It's also set back from the A229 because of the approach to Cranbrook, so that it doesn't raise the profile of the town on that road or coalesce with Turndon and Hartley as with the Ribbon development along the road. And it's set well back from the ancient woodland and the Crane Valley. And here to say that the conserving the LNR is nothing to do with the high wood is not fair. That is a key characteristic. It is the gill streams are an important feature. They are mentioned in the ANB management plan as a key component, and conserving the whole of that gill stream and bringing it into proper management with the associated woodland as part of the scheme would be a significant contribution to the ANB management plan. Also, Sally Marsh mentioned the historic landscape characterisation. This was a pilot study done specifically for this area. It was not done for the whole of Cranbrook, and it was not done for the whole of the ANB or even for the whole of the borough. So, as you say, it picks out features on this site which are of interest, and if the same process were done on other sites, it could equally pick out features on those sites. It is of use. It's not an adopted document. It's a piece of evidence and would be of use to and hopefully inform the scheme. But it's very difficult at this late stage to say that would be a significant reason in order to not allow this allocation.
Can I just interrupt briefly there, because I've just been reviewing the index of core documents in relation to that document, and I don't believe it is one of them.
Which document, sir?
The historic landscape characterisation that you were just referring
No, sir, it's not an adopted document by this
So it's
borough.
not an adopted document, and that's why it's not in
And
the
it's
core
not been submitted to this inquiry.
No, well, I haven't seen it before. It has been, though, referred to now today extensively.
Yes. I am aware of it, and it's something we would like to do, because the Kent landscape characterisation is not as good as other districts, and we would like a borough-wide landscape characterisation. And indeed, we've asked the ANB unit to look into that and talk about the cost of that. But on its own, we don't feel it's very helpful, because it doesn't give any comparative weight or value to other locations if we're trying to do a strategic allocation.
I hear your argumentation on it. The dilemma, though, that it leaves me with, if it's not in the core document box, I can't give it some of my time and make that judgment call on it myself. Whether, whoever's right here, or it may be somewhere in the middle. I think if it's, given that it has been referred to as extensively now as it has, both in submissions and rebuttals, I probably need to see it. Are you content to put it in?
I'm content for it to be submitted to you, sir, and I've got no further comments to make on it.
Fine. Well, I've heard your comments on it. Who wants to submit it? Who's got an electronic copy?
I think the ANB unit would be in their best interest to submit it to you.
Okay. Can that be submitted to the programme officer, please, by the 11th of December?
I think, sir, I've covered most of the points I need to make, but the other point made by Sally Marsh was this built area increase by 20%. I have no idea what evidence this is based on, whether it's based on the actual the area of the site allocations, which we know is not all to be built on, whether it's based on the LBD or whether it's based on the whole of Cranbrook or it includes some of the bits outside the LBD. I've got no idea. I think in terms of the proportion of development to the settlement, that's been set out in the council's documents and the core strategy. But I've no other evidence about this 20%, and it does not sound right to me, sir.
Thank you very much.
Unless you've got any questions for me on that, I will pass you over to my colleague, Katie McFloyd, to deal with the questions on the SA.
Well, I rather rudely interrupted you as you went through, so questions that I was raising have kind of got themselves resolved.
Okay.
Now, so if you hand over.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Excuse my throat. Just to pick up on the queries from the ANB unit about the sustainability appraisal. I think there was a question over the methodology of the cumulative impact assessment that was carried out for Cranbrook. So I would just like to refer you to page 21 of the sustainability appraisal, which describes the methods that were followed, and in particular paragraph 3.32, which states that where impacts are mixed, which is the case in Cranbrook, and you'll see that in table 26, a judgment is made as to whether the cumulative impact is likely to be beneficial, adverse, or uncertain, and that has been the case in Cranbrook because of the mix of impacts. Moreover, though, the the query was, has the evidence base fully considered the great weight applied to the ANOB? And you can see in the scoring matrix for site ALCR4 that the natural and built environment and the ANOB is scored a double negative in the sustainability appraisal, which hasn't happened very often for the sites allocated, suggesting that the great weight has been considered and passed on to the policy officers in determining whether the site should be allocated.
So, testing that, it's then your view that a full and appropriate consideration was given to the adverse nature of the impact on AONB, and the process that you've used has discharged all the duties upon you and has had full and sufficient regard to the AONB management plan.
Yes, I think that's reflected in the double negative score, yes.
And then that's something that goes into the balance, as is the case with, planning decisions the world over.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. Mr. Scully.
Sorry, just a couple of points I wanted to make. One link to that is that obviously the one reason for the taking account of the sustainability appraisal is the way the policy also gets developed. So that's, again, we talked about the areas that are there. Also that we have continued to consult with the ANOB unit on this scheme. They were invited to a site visit, I think it was early this year, with the representative of both developers and planning policy officers to walk the site and give us advice on features and how they saw them being developed prior to developing their master plans. And indeed, I believe Sally Marsh was just this week at a workshop with the developer in Cranbrook. So that positive engagement, I'm sure, regardless of our differences, will continue to ensure, and that's why we have a very specific policy about the ANOB, a particular bullet point wording in the policy about the ANOB and about Cranbrook, to make sure that that message gets through. And we have, I'm afraid, bored the developers to death with this point, saying how important it is. So that's the point I just wanted to make as a final clearing up.
Thank you very much. Now, as I indicated, where things get, shall we say, of a slightly more than ordinarily contentious nature in oral submissions, I have had an iterative process, and I do note that I do have a wish to be reintroduced from the developer side of the room. So I'm going to provide that opportunity. Sensibly then, I will come back to CPR and RE and High Weald, and then I'll give a final summating opportunity to the Council. But I'm conscious that time is very tight now, and we are being asked to leave this room at or close to 4 o'clock.
Thank you. Obviously, when we made our introductory statement, it was very much just trying to give an overview of where we were coming from. We didn't want to go into detailed points if it wasn't necessary to do so. With that said, I would like to come back on various different points. I think the first is just where we're actually starting from. We are here to examine, or you're here to examine, the soundness of the site allocations DPD, which is a daughter plan, which is to implement the strategic decisions that have already been taken on in respect to the core strategy. It sounds like, certainly from what I'm hearing from the AONB unit, and to a certain degree CPRE, that there's almost a desire to re-examine strategic decisions, which is to reallocate growth that was identified for Cranbrook to other settlements. And I think that's beyond the scope of what this DPD is set out to do. Decisions like that would have to be part of a new comprehensive local plan. It's a strategic decision. There was mention again of not being a need for this site to come forward. I don't want to get too detailed into housing land supply points again, but we have to remember that we are a few years into the existing core strategy plan period, yet we've already seen Knights Park released 550 houses, we've seen Bayham Road, and we've recently seen Highgate Hill. So we need to make sure that this plan, if it is going to be effective and is going to go forward, delivers the certainty and delivers the numbers that are needed to make sure that at least the core strategy figures are met. And to suggest that this site could come out because there are potentially other brownfield or town centre sites that may come forward doesn't provide the certainty that's been lacking for 5-6 years already. Again, being succinct, coming back on the policy framework, paragraph 115, 116 are exceptionally important tests, but we need to reiterate that they aren't new tests. They were included in PPS 7. Full regard was had to them when the core strategy was examined. The strategic decision was taken to allocate 300 units worth of growth in Cranbrook, a settlement that is entirely washed over by the AONB, and therefore that's a strategic decision that has been taken. Sustainability appraisal, again, I think it's important to stress, having undertaken many of these types of projects myself, it's a complicated process, and particularly how to score. And you'll see that different authorities and different organisations use a different scoring system. Some use a traffic light approach, some use positives, negatives. And I think the critical point is that sometimes a single double positive can outweigh 9 double negatives. There's not a direct scoring system. It is very much a tool to inform the decision-making process, and to suggest that positives and negatives, independent assessments should be offset against each other is simply not the way that the system's designed to work. Equally, again, without getting too bogged down on the SEA directive, the idea of the whole process is there to test reasonable alternatives. Strictly speaking, there is no legal requirement to take forward the most sustainable option. It's a case of making sure that all issues are fully considered and fully tested. So, coming full circle to your original question as to whether or not the allocation is justified, it all comes back to looking at the reasonable alternatives. Certainly, from my perspective, I don't think just pushing those 300 units to another settlement is a reasonable alternative, because that's not in accordance with the adopted core strategy to which this plan is seeking to implement. In terms of looking at other sites, again, there's simply no better sites or no more sustainable sites available. I appreciate the concerns on both sides, and it is a sensitive site, but this is the best option available if this plan is to go forward and implement the core strategy as it's designed and set out to do. Thank you.
Now, just in terms of a question on that jointly to yourselves and to the council, but it's to take away that sense from those oral submissions that you are asking me to direct myself back to the core strategy and its expectation of housing delivery in Cranbrook as a very particular place, taking account of the fact that there's another chapter and another core strategy provision, another chapter in this plan and another core strategy provision for villages and rural areas, and that a number of the other places that have been spoken of are there.
Yes, just to be very, very specific, that there is a dedicated chapter on Cranbrook within the core strategy, and that strategic decision was taken to allocate 300 additional units within the AONB. It can only be that simple. There are no other alternatives. The settlements, the villages are separate matter.
Because that is where Cranbrook is.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, can we just be clear, and I'll put this back to the AONB, a number of the other alternatives. I mean, it was clarified, for example, when we were talking about the possibility of the prison coming forward, and we had remarks there that would be in the villages and rural areas chapter and not Cranbrook. You did speak about a number of other possible peripheral hamlet sites. I just want to be clear between you whether those sites would be viewed as Cranbrook chapter, Cranbrook core strategy policy, or whether they'd be viewed as villages and rural areas chapter, because, you know, at the end of the day, there is a job of work to be done here, which is to look at the implementation of the core strategy. And what I don't want to do is to start to look at possible alternatives that turn out not to be alternatives in adopted policy terms, if that makes sense. So do we know where those other peripheral settlements that you referred to actually are, whether they are VRA or whether they're Cranbrook?
Willersley Pound, sir, is just up by the roundabout to the north of Cranbrook, and it's some distance from the limits to built development of Cranbrook, and so I believe it would be counted within the villages and rural area.
Yes, sir, it's difficult to comment without knowing the sites, but we have assessed the sites, and that is all set out in our evidence. I'm not aware of what these other brownfield sites are that are being referred to, really. We've only been made aware of the prison today, and as I said, we're not aware of any pre-application discussions on that site.
And okay. Final observations then from AOMB unit and then CPRE.
I just think the original question is the allocation sort of sound and justified, and we maintain that it isn't. And going back to the site templates, the site justification doesn't give any weight to the AOMB, let alone great weight. It's not mentioned. And I think there's been enough discussion here about other possible sites within Cranbrook and its associated satellite settlements to suggest that the allocation, it is possible to deliver the allocation without a significant greenfield development, bearing in mind, and we understand there may be some allocation within that site, but certainly not what's suggested at the moment.
Okay, well that's a conclusion, and certainly one that I will have to take away and deliberate on. CPRE, any further remarks?
I think I won't hold you up any further.
I'm grateful. Obviously, I will take very seriously the submissions that you've already put. Any final or concluding overarching remarks then to be made by the Council?
Just to remind you, sir, the actual statutory duty is to have regard to the purpose, and that is what the Council believes it has done efficiently and effectively.
Thank you very much. In which case, ladies and gentlemen, unless there's anybody around the table with another burning issue to raise, now I do see a pencil being raised.
Sorry, just one query really, and that really is to ask whether the neighbourhood planning, representative neighbourhood planning committee could be invited to a further session to talk about this allocation and Wilkesfields and other alternative allocations within Cranbrook, which they will have more knowledge of than I do.
I will be direct there. The answer to that is no. And the reason it's no is that to be a person who is invited to be heard at a hearing of this nature, one has to be a person who has made a representation on the submission draft local plan. And then one has to request to be heard, in general terms. There are a few parties involved who are invited to be heard because I've invited them, even though they didn't request, and those instances are entities who are typically statutory advisors, who had maybe made a written representation but hadn't indicated whether or not they wished to be heard on it, and there was a matter of controversy that others were challenging, and I felt that it would be useful to invite them in order to resolve whether or not their concerns had been properly met. But in general terms, I don't invite people unless they fulfil that sort of function. And so if we're in a situation, as we are here, where I believe we're very, very early in the neighbourhood plan world in Cranbrook, we didn't even have, as I understand from interrogating the database of written submissions, a written submission from a prospective Cranbrook neighbourhood forum, and no request to be heard either. I think we're a very long way in sort of fairness and natural justice terms from a case that would entitle me to invite somebody, and if I were to invite them, I'm afraid the floodgates open. There are a whole range of other people who no doubt would have loved to have been here, not just for this matter, but for many of the matters, who I also ought invite, because the standard of invitation, in inverted commas, would then be quite low, and I would have to bring many other people in. So for those reasons, yes, the answer is no. Mr. Scully.
Sorry, sir, we didn't get a chance to discuss the plan you asked for. I'm not suggesting we do it, but you were concerned about land ownership and how it met the allocations boundary.
Yeah.
How would you like us to deal with that? Would you like us to have some discussions with the landowners and produce some kind of statement about the site or the boundaries?
I think that would be very useful. We haven't got time to discuss it now. I do have to say I think it's a very straightforward document that graphically answers the questions that I would have put orally anyway. I guess the only one question that it begs then is whether there is any need to adjust the boundaries of the allocation to conform them with the site ownership, whether there's any virtue in having land that maybe wouldn't be developed or wouldn't have an application made on it.
I think that was the point of my question, really. If you invite that, I think there is a small additional amount of land which would be helpful to the management plan that would follow with the application and with the allocation, which I think the landowner is willing to discuss.
Okay, well look, can I suggest, again, an initial response on the 11th? Any feedback from any other party interested or involved by the 24th, and then a final position in writing from the Council by the 6th.
Thank you, sir.
In which case, ladies and gentlemen, we have, I believe, reached... no, we haven't. Mr. Toss still has a point to be made.
Just on a point of clarification, I think, sir, in terms of previous responses, you had given the 8th of January.
Sorry, 8th. I meant the 8th.
The 8th, yeah. Thank you, sir.
Yes, the 6th is horribly tight, isn't it, just after Christmas? 8th, yes. Are we all done?
Sorry, sir, just after some clarification, obviously there was 2 other questions that formed the basis of your, for the session in terms of the mitigation of constraints and capacity of the site. How was you proposing to reconvene to address those, or
I think realistically, if there are other points that need to be put to me, then they need to be put to me in writing now. And I think if we allow a bounce down on the same dates that we've just discussed, then that would enable a developer response, which would be on the first date, on the 11th, and then others to respond by the 24th. That's CPRE and High Weald, and then a final council position on the 8th again. Because I just think we've run out of hearing time. We've got to leave the room. Ladies and gentlemen, let's draw this session to a close. Just a final reminder that we reconvene for those interested in villages and rural areas. We reconvene on Tuesday in committee rooms A and B at 10 a.m.